Okay, some of you were here already. Some of you are just joining us, but welcome to Concordia University's Forest Space. Thank you for joining us for the main event of today, Montreal 2050, a climate haven. Now, just to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from Forest Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, that's right. Here at Forest Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge. We co-create daily activities that examine research questions and projects, things happening across the university. We are running this part of the event also as a live stream Zoom meeting, and we really do welcome your questions and comments there in the chat, and we will either read those out at the end during the Q&A. Those of you here in the space, of course, just raise your hand. We'll get a microphone over to you later on. Okay, I'm happy to introduce again Doctoral Candidate in Geography and Environmental Studies, but also our 2025 Concordia Public Scholar, Alex Pache. Alex, over to you.
Thanks for sticking around, everybody. So we'll have a 40-minute panel discussion and then a 20-minute Q&A. I'm sitting here with Sidney Ribaux, who is the directeur of the, je vais lire en français parce que, the Bureau de la Transition écologique et de la résilience for the city of Montreal. So ecological transition and resilience. And then here we have Dr. Damon Matthews, who is a climate science and sustainability research chair here at Concordia, and Dr. Ursula Eicker, who is the Next Generation Cities Institute director. Thank you all for joining me. So the subject today, of course, is climate havens. I talked about it in my intro presentation, but basically climate haven is a city or region that claims to be a current or future refuge from the most severe impacts of climate change. Some examples of cities labeled like this are Asheville, North Carolina, Buffalo, New York, Detroit, Michigan. And after the unprecedented and devastated flooding that happened from Hurricane Helen this fall, the label climate haven received a new wave of criticism from many media sources, claiming it's a ploy by real estate agencies or by cities to get people to come to their city, even though it's not necessarily safer from climate change. And of course, in Montreal, we've seen we have many heat waves and we've had the wildfire smoke. So it's not super convincing initially to think of Montreal as a climate haven. And we're here to discuss what we all think of climate havens, whether Montreal is one and will become one, if it's prepared to be. And my first question, of course, is what are your thoughts on climate havens? Do you think Montreal has the potential to become a refuge from the worst impacts of climate change? We have a mic here, and we could, you can, okay. And we could start with Sidney, please.
So hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Honestly, it's not a question that we had thought about a lot at the City of Montreal, whether or not we're a climate haven. So we're not part of the group of cities that's promoting ourselves as climate havens. But certainly what we've thought about is what will be the impact of climate change on Montreal and versus other cities, because Montreal is working with other cities nationally and internationally to find solutions, both on the GHG reduction side and on the adaptation side. And certainly when you look at other cities and what they're facing in terms of the impact today, obviously some cities are facing much worse consequences from climate change than what Montreal is facing. So in French we say, lorsqu'on se compare, on se console. So in a sense, so are we a climate haven or not? I'm not sure I agree with that terminology, but certainly from my point of view anyways, I think Montreal is a city that's going to, at least in the short term, have much lesser impacts than other regions of the world and other cities. I mean, some cities, the discussion will be, can we continue to live here, right? I mean, that's not in the foreseeable future a discussion that we're going to have in Montreal, I don't think. That being said, I mean, I would point out a few things. I mean, I think that this is, although we've been studying this for many decades, and I'm curious to hear the both of you on this, but I mean, this is still early days in terms of predicting what will happen in a particular city, right? I mean, this is not an exact science. We have an idea of what's going to go on. We have what's going to happen. We have, you talked a little bit about it in your introduction, Alex, but we know in Montreal it's going to get hotter. We know approximately the number of days that are going to become very problematic. We know there's going to be more rain, more water, therefore more flooding. What was on nobody's radar up until last year was, what are the consequences of forest fires in the north of Quebec, thousands of kilometers away, on the air quality in Montreal? What's less on anybody's mind right now is what's the impact of the changes in the ecosystem, the migration of certain insects, the migration of certain diseases. At this point, it doesn't seem to be a huge issue. What will be the state of that issue in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? So I'm just putting it out there. I mean, I think that certainly there are cities that are better positioned to adapt to climate change in the short term, let's say being a couple decades. And I think Montreal is probably one of them. But, there's still a lot that we don't know. And one of the things we don't know is how quickly all this will evolve, right?
Yeah, I mean, you talked a lot about the general concept. I think scientifically, there's no binary category, right? It's not possible to actually draw any kind of real line that says this city is, this city isn't. So there's always going to be some continuum of climate risk. I think we do know, we do have a pretty good sense of those risks, regionally, locally. I can kind of, agree with the things you said earlier about the big risk factors that Montreal isn't all that vulnerable to, like forest fires, although air quality certainly, as a result of forest fires, is a different question. Sea level rise, storm surges, yeah, not really. But flooding, absolutely. Heat waves, yes. Potentially diseases, various. So, I think we can kind of make a pretty good scientific picture of relative risks in different places, and then that can be used as a way of informing, what might be or might not be safer or more dangerous according to different metrics. I do think also, just one kind of initial reflection, I know you have other questions coming down the line, is that the classic definition of vulnerability is not just what is the physical risk of something bad happening. It is also a socially constructed, how resilient is a system. And so any kind of definition of a climate haven can't just be the physical risk factors. It also has to be the social resilience factors. And so, you had a quote up there actually of some doing refuge is something that's constructed. So if there is to be a climate haven that exists anywhere in the world, it would have to be constructed. Because there's, maybe it exists in a relatively lower risk area, but it would have to be constructed explicitly to be resilient to risks that are going to be there and are going to continue to evolve over the future. Which then also gets into the question of, migration. And part of that, I think, if you want to talk about what is a climate haven also has to be welcoming to refugees, right? And so that is also something that could be constructed, but that's a social decision and a social characteristic that, I can't comment with any expertise on Montreal's current welcoming to outsiders, but it's a difficult question, and it's one that definitely varies quite a lot across the continent.
Yeah, and it's important to note too that climate refugees aren't internationally recognized yet, from my understanding. So you can't get any sort of asylum at this point for a climate-related disaster directly. So hopefully that's something that will come down the line in the future as well, is getting that international recognition. Dr. Eicher?
Yeah, but maybe just to continue, because I agree with everything said so far. I mean, there's of course different levels of government. I mean, especially on the refugee question, it's not a city's decision. I mean, they can be as welcoming as they want, but I mean, and relatively speaking, of course, Montreal is better off than most countries in the global south, I would say. So there will be an incredible pressure on migration, but that's of course not up to the city to decide. So that's a provincial, federal level debate, and there I'm not terribly optimistic, because what we see just now, I mean, worldwide, I mean, the rich countries are all closing their borders already now, and we are still under pretty low pressure situation that will for sure get worse. And that's maybe another point I want to make. I mean, yes, we can think locally, and as I said, climate conditions here are not so bad. I mean, you're sort of, the heat wave stuff, it's happening, of course, but if you come from hotter places, you don't take it so serious. I mean, Canada is still a cold country, so we need to do something about it, but it's not the same dimension as what we see otherwise. But of course, we're on an island, but we're not on an island. I mean, most people do travel, and I think the world on the whole will become much more uncomfortable. It will be there will be lots of risk also if you ever leave the city. And I think we are so used to move around, and there I see incredible disruptions happening because you will want to go to cities that have floods, fires, civil unrest. I mean, the world is going to become a pretty unrestful place, and we can't count on sitting here and sit it all out. I mean, the timescales are too long, and we can't sit it out. So I still think, and we're also not going to be the place who can absorb all the immigration. So I think the focus still needs to be strongly on mitigation. We still just need to do something about it. We need to get our act together. And yes, our electricity system is clean, but it's not even 50% of the total energy. So we have a long way to go. And I think we need to do everything. I mean, city networks, emerge more and more as sort of subnational entities that are taken serious, because all these national pledges need to translate into projects locally in the end. I mean, big infrastructure projects, but also a lot of local action. And I think that will be a very new role that the cities need to do much more, can do much more, have the wish probably also to do much more. And we just need to tackle the problem at its root. I'm still really convinced, because as I said, it's going to get worse so much more before it can get any better, if ever it gets better. If you don't start now, all of us are going to lose, because we're not going to sit here on our little green, cool haven and watch the rest of the world going crazy. I mean, so that was my main.
Right. Yeah, and that's something when I talk about climate change, the climate crisis too. People around me is really focusing on the city level, even, for example, with the election of Donald Trump, and who knows what happens with the federal government in Canada in the near future, that a lot of climate targets will probably not be met. And so looking at the progress at a city level, you could still see a lot of positive things, and Montreal is a great example of that. To move on to another question directed to Dr. Matthews, but for anybody that wants to answer, in the context of climate change, and you've answered it a bit, but if you could give a bit more detail, what are the geographical advantages the region of Southern Quebec has, and what climate-related threats are most concerning for our region in the future?
Yeah, so I mean, you did have a good list already. We're not on the coast, so we're not vulnerable to storm surges. We can get residual hurricanes. We had one come through last summer that intersected with our camping trip, which was rather unpleasant. But there's no immediate forest fire threat. Drought's not a big issue. What else?
In the list?
Okay, so there's a lot of things that so another geographically also, there aren't that many places in the world that have a 50+ degree annual temperature range, and so there's kind of a built-in ability to kind of accommodate a lot of different like climate conditions. So that I think is another thing that we have going for us here. But there are like, if we're having this conversation in 2019, it would be a very different flavor because we would have just come through it like an unprecedented flood that affected much of the city. Or two of them, in fact, one in 2017, one in 2019. And I mean, that kind of flood is going to happen again. I mean, we don't exactly know when, but clearly it had an anthropogenic signature. And so that type of event is an issue here. I mean, yes, heat waves are, maybe not as severe in some parts of the world. At the same time, any departure from what is like, normal for an area is a risk factor. And so that, summers in Montreal are going to continue to get hotter. Things like tornadoes and like extreme wind are also a risk factor that is very kind of salient to this part of the world. And then also like the kind of, the freezing rain type events that Montreal does know quite well. But, as winters get warmer, there's gonna be more and more of that winter season that's kind of on the cusp of whether it rains or snows or falls as some other. So, we're already seeing more like high rainfall events during the winter. And so the likelihood of those rainfall events occurring as freezing rain instead is going to also increase in the near future. So there are risk factors. And again, I think we can probably agree that relative to most of the world, those risk factors are smaller, but also that reflects like our ability to withstand. I mean, Canadian cities in general are more resilient than much of the world. And so the physical climate risk is maybe a little lower in Montreal compared to some immediate equivalent cities in North America. The resilience is probably a little bit higher. I mean, it's not like our infrastructure is that resilient. It is kind of crumbling all around us in different ways. So, there are kind of infrastructure issues as well that need to be dealt with. But again, I mean, the physical risk is really is maybe not even the most important piece of whether or not a place is going to be viable and like safe to live in for generations to come. There's a really important social component to that can be constructed, I think, over time.
And when you said anthropogenic signature for the flooding, is that to mean that from climate change, or is it from management negligence around dams? Because I know part of the flooding risk in Montreal is also related to how the dams are managed.
Yeah, but I mean, there was a study that came out immediately after those floods, saying that yes, we can say that event was more likely to occur because of climate change having occurred than would have been. And there's actually a very one of the scientific advances over the last 10 years is the ability to very quickly actually point to a particular extreme event and put a probability on whether that would have happened in the absence of climate change. And so, basically every extreme event that happens these days, you can attribute some portion of that to the fact that the world is warmer, and sometimes it's small, but the extreme event is always going to be at this point worse because of climate change, and we can quantify that scientifically. So that's what I meant by anthropogenic signature. Right. I mean, the 2019, 2017 floods. Yes, there are confounding factors, there are management issues, but this is where there's potential to decrease risk by improving those management decisions and deciding where we build and how hydrology is managed. And I mean, those are really important risk factors, but from a physical climate perspective, that event was more severe because of it having occurred in a warmer climate relative to, what would have been the case if we hadn't been increasing the amount of energy and water in the climate system over time.
And the way that's measured is a model is run if there was no anthropogenic, so human emissions, and then it's compared to what?
Yes, yeah. So you need a counterfactual. It's a modeling exercise. You have a counterfactual world where there's no climate change, no human-induced climate change, and then you have a world where there is human-induced climate change, and you basically calculate the probability of a certain magnitude event happening in those two worlds. Right. And it's almost always the case that there's a higher probability of it occurring in the climate-warmed world relative to the counterfactual world. Right. And so that gives you a kind of a statistical estimate of how much more likely a particular event that, I mean, there's always in hindsight, the particular event that did happen, we can say it's, 20% more likely that happened, or 20% more severe because of the influence of a warmer climate.
Right. Did either of you want to comment on that, or?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, like, with what's going on in Los Angeles right now, where you have a fire in a city, literally. What's the risk? It's obviously a risk factor for Quebec. Forest fires are obviously a risk for Quebec. How does that pan out regionally? Like, how far south does that risk come? Do we know that?
I think we probably do know it. I don't think I know it right now, so I'll have to.
But I do know that the study that our lab actually did with pollen and charcoal in sediment, that in the eastern townships, so Orford area, the return interval, so how often fires happened in that forest, was around every 500 years. So, of course, that's likely to increase because of climate change, but it's pretty rare for forest fires to occur in the temperate forest. Yeah.
That's reassuring.
Yeah. Our backyards won't be on fire anytime soon, hopefully. So, Dr. Eicker, as the director of the Next Generation Cities Institute, which is here at Concordia, could you please explain to us what a next generation city is and what makes Montreal poised to become a next-gen city?
I mean, simply speaking, I would say a next generation city is a sustainable city in all its dimensions. So inclusive, affordable for the social dimension, and on the ecological side, zero emission and biodiverse, and the other spectrum of ecological dimensions. So I think that's where we want to get to. As I said, we have still a long way to go. I mean, in a way, we started from a rather easy baseline of having nearly 100% renewable electricity. That led actually to the sort of bit counterintuitive fact that we just waste a lot of energy. I mean, the building sector that you showed in your graph, I mean, is often heated purely electric, not even a heat pump. So it's, of course, a complete waste of this sort of very valuable resource, electricity. So although it's zero emission, it's still super wasteful. And if you look at the sort of the energy consumption in buildings compared to European cities, even if you take out the climate, which is harder here, we just use much more energy. And so the building sector has a long way to go. We need to retrofit. We need to change the systems to much more efficient systems. And then, of course, transport. I mean, again, it's a bit of a sort of multi-level government thing, because, I mean, what we definitely need more is public transit options, and for the city to go alone on that is practically not possible. So again, provincial government, federal government needs to be involved. So many of these, some issues can be solved purely locally, and I think the city is doing a good job in sort of sharpening bylaws of, first of all, talking about energy consumption, making the bigger buildings publish, first of all, their data. And that's normally the first step of saying, give me your data. We look at it, we say it's terrible, so you need to improve. So then, but I think it's the first step to then say, well, let's now tighten the rules and give clear targets well in advance so that the industry can adapt to it. And in the transport sector, I mean, it's a long struggle to get away from the single car mode, even if they would be all electric. I mean, it's which is a question of price, of course, but I think that I don't think it's a good solution, because we have, and that's another aspect of what I would consider a next generation city, just a different way of living, working, playing in the city. So that means not every street is full of cars, whether they're parked, mostly they're parked. Very rarely do they actually move, but the kind of space use that we give to individual cars is just huge. And but it's a process which involves everybody, because you see that at every bike lane project there's protests. So at every parking space removal there's protests. So it's not that the population is super ready and wants to go for it and say, well, let's get rid of or make parking extremely expensive. So people don't like it, don't like to change their ways. So I think the city is pushing a lot on this agenda for both in transportation and also on the building sector, but it's definitely not going fast enough. And again, you can't just do it all by tightening rules or forbidding things if you don't have alternatives. So if we take away the use of private car transit by reducing parking spaces, or you need to offer alternatives, and that comes typically with large investments in infrastructure. And I think so there needs to be a better playing together between these different levels of government to really improve the offer to make it happen. So as I said, the city just now is doing what they can. It's not moving very fast because it's a complex topic involving, of course, the citizens who need to go along with these changes, but also provincial governments who tend to not strongly push for public transit, to say it diplomatically. So it's, I think there could be a lot more happening if every level of government would really have the same kind of vision and mission and put the money to the pledges of emission reductions.
Right. So that is a good segue into more of the specifics of how Montreal is preparing, because Montreal has released multiple ambitious plans on how to deal with climate, how to deal with housing, transportation. So, and in general, they're very inspiring. There's really a lot to look at in those plans. And Montreal also pledged to be carbon neutral by 2050, in line with a lot of international targets. And the city, I think, is one of the best poised in North America to achieve such a goal of carbon neutrality, given our renewable energy structure, our progressive culture, and our commitment to municipal leaders. So a question for all of you, what are some inspiring examples of climate action in Montreal, whether in the plans or stuff that you have experienced yourself, or of the city building resilience to climate change? What's something that has really inspired you? Start with Sydney, please.
So we are doing a lot on climate, and the city is very committed to both adapting and to reducing emissions. With the caveat that you mentioned, that we don't have all the jurisdictional powers. So there's a lot of things that Montreal would like to do but can't do, or needs the province to intervene, or in more rare cases needs the federal government to intervene. But I would mention that the work we're doing on buildings. I mean, I think that's where we do have basically full jurisdiction. So Montreal has adopted regulations that will force all buildings in Montreal to be climate neutral by 2040. So we're one of the few places in Canada, at least, that has done that. It's a very, and you were talking about it before, it's a very basic approach that we should have taken 10 or 15 years ago. But we have now prohibited fossil gas in new buildings, which was obviously the first step to make sure that new buildings are not emitting. And we've had in place for the past 3 years regulations that will slowly bring existing buildings, as they renew and renovate their heating systems, to get rid of their old furnaces and install more efficient and more and climate neutral, basically, emissions. So when we started working on this was in our climate plan that was adopted in 2020. When we started working on this, I talked to quite a lot of people within the city, and the response of most of my colleagues was, well, you can't do this. And the response of many people in the community was, you can't do this, this is impossible, it will never get done. And we kept moving forward on this, and we were finally able to convince this administration that I think that's had a lot of courage on many of these initiatives to say, okay, we're going to do it, even though there's not necessarily a consensus that we can do this, but we're going to do it anyways. And now that we've done it and we've put in place this regulation, the province, which was hesitating to do this, has looked at what's happened in Montreal, has, to a certain extent, it's surprising that the building sector and even the gas company have not been pushing back very strongly on what we've done. And so the province has said, oh, this is doable. And so they've now announced, and they've just adopted legislation to go ahead and do the same thing province-wide. So what Montreal has done, and that's why I'm talking about it, is it's now having an impact outside of Montreal. And I think in many cases, what we're going to do at the city level, there's nothing that a city can do, by the way, that a province can't do, right? The powers that cities have are given to them by the province. So anything that we can do, provinces can do as well. And so I think a big part of what we can do in Montreal is to sort of start working on certain issues, start regulating, start taxing certain things to sort of show the way so that provinces can then follow suit and just increase the impact by 2 or 3 times, right? And this is what's happening in buildings.
Yeah, that's really great, and it's another example of the city of pioneering, and we see that as well with just simple things like Bixi, which has been exported. The bike sharing service has been exported all over. New York City uses the same system as us, based on us, and then our car sharing Communauto as well. So Montreal is really pioneering in a lot of ways like that, and has a huge influence.
Maybe just to add it, I mean, New York actually did the same thing years before. So I don't know whether you looked at it. So I mean, they did exactly the same thing. So made everybody publish the data, then so gradually with giving everybody a few years to really change their ways, but tightening now the rules for reduction. That from, I would say, after in 2030 or 2031, it's really going to hurt if you don't retrofit. It's just you need the fines then become bigger than investing the money in the retrofit. And of course, it's a pretty heavy measure politically, so you need to have some courage to do it. But I think it's the only way, because you can't leave it up to every individual to be ethical, or it just won't work. There's too many actors, and I think it's actually the right way to go. I mean, the only thing where I see still a bit of pushback, and maybe more talking, more even collaboration with universities are needed, is this thing about, I mean, there's still the bioenergy aspect that has 20% gas in it around, and actually for hydro, it's easier, of course, to manage with the existing distribution grid infrastructure. So it's not such a trivial problem. Say just electrify everything and we're going to be green, because we need to be living with an existing infrastructure. If all the mobility sector is supposed to electrify as well. So it's never been built for this. So unless we at the same time drastically reduce consumption, it's just not going to work. I mean, we need to invest, and that's why these bioenergy solutions are still pushed so much by hydro, because they have no easy solution for the winter peaks. So I think there's still a lot of thinking involved of what is actually the optimal solution on the long run that can run. So because it's as I said, it's easy, and at the beginning it works to say, well, we electrify everything, but not with an infrastructure that has never been built for this. So I think that's a good sort of, and everything we're talking about, the district energy solutions, where you don't need to supply every individual building, you supply 1,000 buildings, you can build big storage tanks, you can buffer the energy, you can reduce the peaks. So there are solutions around there, they haven't been built much. I mean, there's maybe a few examples here and there in Toronto and in Canada, but it's not that there's sort of large-scale experience. So I think we need to start also this experimenting, saying let's just build a few systems, show also the private sector, the private promoters, that it can work, and that it's not crazy expensive. So it needs to, because that's nobody's really willing to pay the price just now neither to build more green. So I think we need to really start building it, demonstrating that it works, and what exactly the extra costs are. On the life cycle, it always works. I mean, but people mostly look at what they pay at the beginning. So unfortunately, but that's another debate. I mean, financing instruments that make it not more expensive over the life cycle of a building. And last point, I mean, you mentioned it already, I think the sharing models. I mean, I think that's a model that could become much stronger in Quebec, not just for mobility, but also all kinds of other goods and services to be shared. I think that's the best way of saving resources and at the same time freeing up public space if everybody would just use car sharing services or bike sharing we have as well. So I think that's another, we haven't talked much about resource issues, but sharing models for sure help with that as well.
Okay. So the 2024 update for the Montreal Climate Plan shows that there is good progress, that there remain significant challenges in achieving the 2030 targets, especially in transportation and industry. But of course, many of these efforts take more than just 4 years, because the update, or 3 years even, because the update was from data from 2023. And Montreal is ahead in a lot of ways because while a lot of other cities are just figuring out how to have renewable energy, we're already past that point and looking at the other ways to reduce our carbon footprint. So besides what we've already talked about, what are some of the biggest challenges in decarbonizing the city, and how will we overcome them? Are things like buildings, just like the low-hanging fruits, like the things that are easy to tackle now, or is there more challenging things coming up after that?
I mean, I think probably both of you can comment on this with more expertise than me, but it doesn't, I mean, just picking up on what Ursula was just saying, I mean, yes, we have renewable energy, but there's still renewable energy challenges. Like, there isn't enough renewable energy to support all the energy consumption in the middle of winter in Montreal. So I think there is still an energy supply challenge, and yeah, maybe it's things like district heating or rooftop solar or various ways of like generating and using energy more efficiently, or like making use of car batteries as backup energy supply. Like there's lots of things that could still be done that are like not really on the horizon or not really in the current discourse it I think there is a sense that we've kind of solved the renewable electricity challenge already, and that's not the case. We're just it just happens that we use hydro and other people don't, and so it also wasn't done with like a climate objective in mind, right? It was an accident of geography, basically, that Quebec has, hydroelectricity that's low carbon. So I mean, I think that's also then an opportunity, because yes, like other cities that don't have renewable electricity already, their first challenge is going to be figuring out how to generate renewable electricity, but then they will then still have the other things that Montreal is going to have to figure out now in order to move forward in terms of scaling that renewable electricity to like not just cover current electricity demand, but like all energy demand ultimately. And so I think there's actually a really important like role for a city like Montreal that is already at that point of needing to figure out that problem now, to kind of figure it out and like potentially export those solutions to other cities.
Yeah, and on the Hydro-Quebec subject, there was actually a panel at Forest Space a year and a half ago or something with somebody from Hydro-Quebec, and he was explaining how if we were to electrify all the car fleet and all of heating, that we would need like 40% or 30 to 40% more hydro dam capacity. So that involves building a lot more hydro dams, and that if all the electric cars in downtown Montreal, if all the charging stations there and they increase the charging stations, if they all pulled at the same time, that he said they would melt the power line. So there's still a lot to do in that, and with that regard as well. Sydney, please.
Yeah, so I guess this is not a panel on energy. But if you are interested on some of these questions on energy, have a look at Hydro-Quebec's plan, their 10-year plan, and honestly, I think it's the best plan, certainly in Canada, in terms of meeting our targets. So the plan is really like, here's how we're going to produce and save enough electricity to be able to do all the stuff that we want to do on the climate side, right? Because you need to everything you're going to replace. When you're replacing the fossil fuels, which is whatever 50 to 60% of what we're consuming in terms of energy, you're basically replacing it not only but mostly by electricity. So the big challenge is, how do you increase that production? And so Hydro-Quebec has a viable plan right now to do that, but it's very, very ambitious. I mean, one of their biggest challenges is, are we going to have enough workers to be able to build everything we need to build in the next 10 years? You know, so I mean, that's the kind of challenge that we're facing in order to meet these huge issues. But going back to your question on like, what's our biggest challenge in the city? I think our biggest challenge is that what we're talking about is very nerdy. And there's very, very few people who are actually interested in this. Like, it's amazing that there's like, whatever, 25 people in this room listening to us talk about these issues, right? I mean, who wants to talk about insulating your house? You know, like who thinks about their house and says, yeah, I really need to insulate my walls, right? And who thinks about the energy they're consuming when they're moving around point, like including in your car, or no matter whatever, how you, and who gets up in the morning and, you know, thinks, I would really like to have more a bus line come in front of my house. Like, there's very, very few people who think about that. And so I would say our biggest challenge at the city, and the other part is, not many people, if they do think about these things, they don't really think of the city as being part of the solution or an important actor on these things, right? So you would think, you know, who does the building code? Well, that's the province. And who takes care of roads? Well, that's the province. And so most of the interest from our fellow geeks who are interested in this and who are either in industry or in environmental groups or in other sectors or in the research sector, their work is targeting, and these are the exceptions here, but I mean, their work is targeting either provinces or federal government. So there's very, very little interest in the city. So if you're an elected official at the city, you almost never get a question about what you're doing on climate change. You almost, from the citizens who elected you, you almost never get a question around, you know, how are we going to produce more solar energy, or how are we going to become more energy independent, and so on and so forth. And so my pitch to you guys who are interested in this is like, come and talk to the city. You know, come and talk to your elected officials about this. If this is a preoccupation, if climate is a preoccupation, you can't stop there. You need to be preoccupied by what are the actual solutions to climate, and who are the people who are actually going to do something about it. So I'll give you one example. The city of Montreal has its annual budget is $7 billion. And every year we spend about a month, two to 3 weeks, I think, in public commissions talking about our budget. And citizens can come and ask anything they want. We almost never get questions around climate. You know, we get questions about a whole lot of, first of all, there's very few people who come and ask questions about Montreal's budget. But when they do, they rarely ask about this. And this is where the buck stops, right? If we're not, like, everything we're talking about here in terms of solutions, we're able, you know, we have plans to do all of this. The question is, how much resources are we as a community willing to put into renovating buildings or building public transit? Montreal could be financially independent with regards to public transit. New York is. Basically, New York, I think its budget is 90% sufficient. So it does not depend on the state to decide whether or not it's going to expand its metro system, for example. Same thing in Paris, same thing in other cities. Montreal could be like that. But I mean, there's a cost to that. And there needs to be a support from citizens for politicians to have the courage to go there. And so I would say the biggest challenge for Montreal, and I think it's the same provincially and it's the same for other cities, is there isn't enough of a voice in the public sector, not in the public, in the civil society space, pushing us to do more.
It's a really interesting comment you made, because I mean, me coming from Europe, I never thought that way, because there, and maybe because I mean, cities do a lot on climate action in European cities, and they're made responsible for it. And if what you're saying, if that's true, I mean, then I guess it means, I think there's a lot of people concerned about climate action. I mean, there's been millions here on marches, and so I don't think it's that people are not interested in it, but I think as often there's just such a gap between pledging or to do something and then translating that into some concrete action, saying, okay, it means my building is too wasting energy or so, and we need to do something about it. And I think that's in general the problem. There's a lot of, I mean, municipal action plans, provincial, national action plans, and at some point we see, oh, we're never going to meet the targets, because it just didn't manage to translate these pledges, which are pretty similar everywhere, into financeable projects. And whether it's the citizens who should put more pressure on that, or whether the city could do it by themselves, it's a really good question. So maybe there needs to be more mobilization, more sort of bridging the gap, or say, oh yeah, I see we have a problem with climate change, and now let's find some concrete actions, and let's find the money, especially to really implement these actions. I think that's a really good point to be made, and I think everything we are trying to work on also in the Cities Institute is going all the way until a project becomes understanding enough, until it becomes bankable. Because if you don't go all the way, if you just do some academic studies and say, oh yeah, maybe hydrogen is the solution, and you know it will never be financed, and there's no actor, there's no industry, it just won't get done. And I think in every sort of solution space that we're looking at, we probably need to go all the way of who's actually doing it, because the city alone for sure will not have the money. So we need to mobilize the capital from the private sector, maybe even not just from the private enterprise sector, but also from private people. Bring that money together, crowdsource the money, whatever it is, but see a project through to the end. Because I think we're really lacking in implementation. I think the ideas are on the table, but it doesn't get done. So in a way, yes, I would say we are on a good way, at least sort of in terms of vision. But if you look if I have visitors from Germany coming to show them a real sustainable project in Montreal, I don't really know what to show. I mean, it's really difficult. There's not a neighborhood where you say, okay, here everything has been nicely done. It's inclusive, the rents are affordable, they've all been retrofitted, there's green spaces and so on. So I think we need to see more action on the ground, visible action, because the problem often with this sort of heating system change, yes, nobody's interested because it's in your cellar. You can't even show off to your neighbors because nobody sees it. So more visible action, and I mean, if it's in your cellar, maybe we should have sort of displays outside or explaining the stuff. I think there needs to be a lot done so that people know more what it really means between sort of confessing, I want to do something against climate, and then doing something in their realm of possibilities.
Yeah, and I would just push back a bit on that people aren't interested in climate, because even if we look in 2019, we had the biggest march arguably in the world of over 500,000 people. So people are they're maybe not interested in the details, and that's the key part. Yeah, but maybe every 5 or so years we should try to have that 500,000 people march again, just to keep the pressure on. We'll move. We have about 10 minutes left. I think we'll move to Q&A if anybody in the audience has questions for our panel members.
If anyone online would like to ask a question, you can feel free to type it in the chat, or you can use the raise hand function and we'll call on you to turn on your cameras. For those of you here in the space, just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Sick. Hi. Great panel. Absolutely loved it. The question I have for you all is, I know myself personally, other people experience a sort of climate burnout in terms of our own individual responsibilities in the face of larger entities globally that conduct massive environmental damage. So in that kind of vein, how much does a city have control over its own climate fate in relation to a country that maybe doesn't follow the same policies, or a region of the world that doesn't follow the same policies, or even globally? How does Montreal control its own destiny compared to the rest of the world's environmental choices?
No, I don't have a specific answer. Maybe you have a better answer. I mean, I think understanding spheres of influence is really important, like conceptually, and that applies to you as an individual, applies to Montreal as a city, applies to a country. Like, yeah, there's always going to be different spheres of influence, different things that are under a particular entity's control, and things that aren't. And like, I think it's kind of a sort of philosophical answer to, like, what should we do to solve this problem, is like, think about what are the things you can directly influence and try to change them. And we were just this morning, we were in a climate action plan committee meeting for Concordia. And this didn't come up, but it has in the past. Like, what are the actual emissions it is within Concordia's jurisdiction to actually decrease, right? And there's a lot of, like, it's really easy to get distracted by the kind of complicated measurement questions, like the further you get out, or these overlapping jurisdictional questions. But I think a really important rule of thumb is, like, pick the things that you can actually change and focus on those, and don't worry so much about the other stuff. And so for, like, Concordia, I mean, it does come down to, like, our natural gas boilers, right? Like, we need to get rid of our natural gas boilers, and that's an expensive proposition. So we need to, like, get support from other places to allow that to happen. Or decide to, like, prioritize it enough to make it happen, and certainly stop building new buildings with new natural gas boilers, which happened a few years ago, unfortunately. But then on an individual level also, like, what can you actually influence and change? It's, if you can afford to change the heating system in your house, yes, that's one thing. If you can afford to buy an electric car, that's another thing. If you can get rid of your car, that's another thing. I mean, even something like, your diet, it's actually really hard to influence the carbon footprint of your diet, right? Even by dietary changes, right? Because it's the emissions happen so far away from your own personal activities. So I think kind of being able to understand and, like, conceptualize spheres of influence and focus on those as the priority for, like, either you as an individual or a city or an institution like Concordia is actually really important to do that, and to do it clearly and consistently.
I just add to the campus thing, because in a way, it's like a small city. I mean, it's only, okay, we have only, 100 buildings or so, but it's still a significant consumer. And I think the challenge is pretty similar. I mean, yes, we need to change the gas boilers, but then, as you know, we're running on a deficit as it is, and it's of course not the mission of the university in the first mission to be zero emission. So in a way, this investment cost competes with all the other things we want to do in teaching and research and so on. So and very often it falls under the table. So, and I think probably pretty similar for the city. The city also wants to decarbonize all their own buildings and their plans, but it costs, I don't know, I have the total number in mind, but it's hundreds of millions, if not more. So, and the city, of course, has lots of other tasks, and if they would just say, okay, let's just spend it on this, there will be a lot of pushback also from citizens who probably say, no, the schools are more important than what you do with your buildings. So, in a way, we need to to solve this financing issue of, because many of these solutions are not actually more expensive in the long run. So if you do a real life cycle costing, it mostly works if you go for electric heat pumps or so. So then it becomes a question of finding the capital for this initial investment and good conditions, long amortization times for the payback. So but then you need to be talking to banks, to capital givers who typically we don't talk to. And I think that needs to change. I mean, we need to, that's what I meant before, of saying we need to think the projects through, not just, that's the easiest bit of saying, let's change to such and such a system, but how to do it under public procurement rules. We're not even allowed to talk to companies before we do a project. So it's pretty complicated to get the buy-in of companies who, with you, develop a good solution where researchers can even come in and bring some innovation. So we're working on that. But sometimes it requires a bit of a change of rules, especially in the public sector. And then, as I said, access to capital. And so I guess we need to involve the business people much more than we do just now on these financing solutions to really make it happen.
So I feel like there's two parts to your question. If the part of the question is, to what extent is Montreal able to go ahead with its own climate plan in the context of other jurisdictions? So the answer to that is, Montreal has a lot of leeway in terms of what it can do on climate. So I was mentioning buildings, for example, where we have basically full jurisdiction. It took a lot of work to convince my colleagues that we had full jurisdiction, but we did it. So we have that. We could also have full jurisdiction on transportation. It would require some political change and some legislative changes, but I think it's something that's doable. So a city like Montreal can do quite a lot, irrespective of, well, I shouldn't say irrespective. I mean, for some of the work that we want to do, it doesn't really matter who's in government provincially and certainly not federally. For other parts, we're going to need to work with the province or get their collaboration on it. The federal government has basically no impact on or very, very little impact on what we do on climate, certainly. An interesting fact is that apart from signing treaties, the federal government, there's basically nothing the federal government can do that provinces can't do on climate. There's some exceptions to that, but I mean, there's migratory birds and there's a few things that, navigable waterways but where they have jurisdiction and on environment, but basically on the environment in general and on energy in particular, it's provincial jurisdiction. So if you're wondering like where should I be putting my time or investing, who should I influence? I mean, certainly the federal government can do a lot, and they have done a lot in the past 8 years. I'm not sure in the next 8 years how much work they're going to be doing on this issue. But in a sense, what that means is that we should change, or if governments change, for example, we should change our focus towards provinces and municipalities who do have a lot of jurisdiction on these issues.
Yeah, and I would just say, add to that, something that I say to people is being informed yourself about the issues and the reasons we should make certain changes really allows you to have a ripple effect. And so when you do get any pushback on certain ideas, whether it be plastic bags or paper bags instead of plastic bags, or utensils or composting, just being able to argue why it's important will change their mind or try to change their mind. That could have a ripple effect and really change things in general. We have time for maybe one more quick question. Maybe we'll...
Take both.
Yeah, okay.
Both questions.
Okay, great. We'll go to the back first.
Okay, this is a quick question. What are European cities doing to make these projects happen that we're not doing here in Montreal?
Take the other question.
Take the other question.
Which Here in the front.
So there's discussion about mitigating the effects of climate change or being well prepared, but is something like carbon capture actually a viable solution for potentially reversing the effects? Your face changed, so I'm guessing no.
Okay, carbon capture. So there's two things. Carbon capture is actually not a like reversibility thing. If you just say carbon capture, that's like preventing emissions, basically like putting something on top of a smokestack or in a tailpipe to like prevent emissions. So that's more of a mitigation technology. Potentially could decrease emissions if like existing power plants were retrofitted with carbon capture technology, but it's very expensive, very energy intensive itself. It's not 100% effective. And it's usually probably easier just to build something else that doesn't burn fossil fuels, and rather than try to retrofit an existing thing with capture technology. Carbon removal is something else, which you can use the similar technologies in terms of like where you store the carbon, but it actually takes carbon out of the atmosphere. To do that, with any degree of permanence, like to store it geologically, take it directly out of the air, it's like, even more expensive. There's a couple of examples in Iceland of active carbon removal facilities. And like in the carbon offset markets, those things sell for, many, many hundreds of dollars a ton, because it's like so, rare, but and it's also the only example of kind of really permanent removal and storage that's going on in the world right now. The vast majority of removal discussions are around, planting trees and nature-based removal, which is, yes, can help and can do lots of good things, but we're nowhere near the point of like being able to reverse anything, because there's current removals globally are still less than just emissions of carbon from land use activities, and like much less than emissions from fossil fuels. And so in order for those things to have any real effect, we actually need to get emissions down to less than that removal capacity, which is going to be small. And then at that point, yes, maybe slowly we can start to actually sequester more carbon in natural systems, underground, maybe in the deep ocean, and kind of scale that capacity up slowly over time. But that's only after we've done all the other stuff to get emissions done. Would that have any real effect?
Okay, on the cities part, European cities part, I would say that they have been more proactive on rules and regulations, bylaws, I would say, in many domains. I think the city of Frankfurt decided that all new construction needs to be passive building standards. I don't know, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, a long time ago. So set very, very high standards for their own buildings. There's a sort of obligation, that's even a federal obligation, for every community, every municipality in Germany to come up with a heat map plan, a kind of district energy plan of saying, you need to map out where district heating is already in place, which areas probably going to get district heating, so we don't make wrong decisions of forcing people to change now their gas boilers when in 5 years there's going to be a district energy system, for example. So cities were are forced currently to make these heat plans, so that there's a clear strategy for municipality what will happen in the next 20 years, where there will never be a district energy solution, so people can go for solar and heat pumps, or where there are district energy solutions, where there are sort of waste heat sources that can be supplied to the buildings. So this kind of holistic planning has gone pretty far in many European cities. It goes down solar is much more common in Europe because there were laws of feed-in tariffs. And I think the whole concept of community energy solutions in Europe is very strong everywhere, and even in the most conservative countries now, because the European Commission introduced that as a legal entity driven by citizens. So actually the owners of these community energy systems are a group of citizens. And sometimes the city itself supports these projects. gives money, allows the rents out roofs from public buildings to have people install the solar systems, and there's a real community of these kind of citizen groups, I would call them, emerging that manage and share and trade energy, and that's huge actually, and that's recognized as a real future contribution to the European energy supply. And I think we are very far from this, because here we have Hydro-Québec, very nice, but it's a centralized utility, and there's think centrally, like every big utility in Europe does as well. And I think we need a bit this sort of counter movement and say, why not have citizens do their own thing? I mean, we're not talking about huge sums of money anymore, and it's a different group driving the transition, and they don't need to conflict, but I think it would be very interesting to allow these kind of experimentation of here in Canadian cities, because we are also taking a big risk, because all our power comes from very far away. If there's some serious climate events, ice storms, you mentioned it, transmission lines can get cut and we are out of power everywhere. It's a risky gamble. So to have a bit more local supply, even from a resilience perspective, would really make sense. And we shouldn't just always think, oh yeah, that's our utility who does it all. They also have their budget issues. So I think new instruments, new sort of forms of participation, of creating these sort of energy communities would be also a great thing. And maybe we could start one at Concordia.
All right, everybody, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Ribaux, Dr. Matthews, and Dr. Eicker. It was a very interesting conversation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Please, a round of applause for our panelists. So that wraps up the panel. Right after this, in about 10 minutes, I will be having a one-on-one interview with Oriol Galvalda, who is the decarbonization lead here at Concordia, and we'll talk about Concordia's plan to get net zero. So same sort of conversation, but specifically for Concordia. So please stick around for that. In about 10 minutes, we'll have a little bathroom break, coffee break. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for bringing this conversation here to ForSpace. Just going to let you know, we're going to close up the live stream, but we'll keep the Zoom open for anyone who wants to stick around for the conversation following. But just to let you know that the conversation remains available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit it or share it. Okay, thank you.